again. Welcome to The Bridge. Today we have a special guest. Nick Stankovic is an expat from Serbia who spent a decade living in the US and now resides in the beautiful coastal city of Qingdao in Shandong, China. He regularly posts about his life on X, where you can find him under his handle, Nick Stankovic _. Welcome to The Bridge, Nick.
Very happy to be here, Jason. I've been following you for a very long time, and I'm very happy to be here.
Well, I follow you too. You know, you post some very interesting content. Can you kick us off and tell us a little bit about your background?
Okay, well, I was born in Serbia, grew up in Serbia, and actually back then it was still Yugoslavia, and then former Yugoslavia, right? The big Yugoslavia. And I ended up in the U.S. because my mom she had a bunch of connections in the U.S. She was an exchange student in the 60s or something, and then she knew some people, and so I wanted to go back, or my mother, I was quite young, so my mother wanted me to go back and learn English and spend a year or two in the U.S. And so that happened, and I somehow found myself in the U.S. as the war in former Yugoslavia started, in the 90s, the civil war, and I was right before. So I didn't leave for the U.S. because of the war. I sort of found myself as the war started, and the plan actually was not to stay in the U.S. for a long time. I was going to learn English and spend a couple of years and probably go back to Yugoslavia and attend university. But then my mom called and said, don't come back. And it was it was
Wow.
yeah. I mean, I watch what's happening in Ukraine now, and with a lot of people now, a lot of Ukrainians in Europe and the U.S., of course, young people, men who are military aged men, and I very much feel what they feel. It's not fun to have to think about those things at that age. In any case, I stayed in the U.S. and I attended university. I was actually at Southeast Missouri State, because I was in St. Louis for my senior year in high school. So anyway, that finished. I went to California, and then I was working for a company, and they said, which was working in, had a lot of offices in Asia, Hong Kong and Taiwan and Japan and Korea and so on. This is early 2000s, okay, 2001. So they said, they said, you want to go to Hong Kong, or you want to, they wanted to send me as an expat to Hong Kong, because they had very little presence in the U.S. They obviously had an office. And I said, sure. So I ended up in Hong Kong, and worked there, lived there for a year, working for this company, and then because it was. Some people might remember it was .com crash, so my company actually decided to close the Hong Kong office, and we all got. I mean, there was a local office and a bunch of people there, but there was a bunch of us from the U.S. and they said, you guys are officially laid off from the Hong Kong office, but you're welcome to come back and we'll rehire you back in the U.S. And obviously, a lot of my Hong Kong or a lot of my U.S. colleagues went back, but I said no. I don't want to go back. And the reason was because I kind of knew that the U.S. office was going to close as well. Mm. And while I was in Hong Kong that 1 year, which was my first time in Asia, everybody was talking about China being sort of the next big thing. Remember, back then I was working for, it was Web 1.0. It was the whole .com thing. It was the, a big thing that was happening. And then as it was sort of winding down, we knew it was going to explode at some point. Nobody knew when, but at some point, everybody knew it was going to explode, and it's going to come back at some point. But everybody was talking about China being the next big thing. And I was in Hong Kong, the mainland. And a very interesting story that I've told a couple of times, in various places actually online, is that I was in Hong Kong. So I didn't want to go back to the U.S., but I started looking for work in Hong Kong. And I interviewed in a couple of jobs, and I went to a couple of interviews, and they look at my resume, and they, interview whatever. They said, this is great. We will hire you. Can you speak Mandarin Chinese? And this is in Hong Kong, 2001. And I said, I can't even speak Cantonese. Why would you ask me that? It's kind of like, weird question. And they said, well, we're hiring people for the mainland. And if you can speak Mandarin Chinese, you're hired. And if you can't, you know, it's not your resume, it's not you, but we really need people who speak Mandarin Chinese. And I said, okay, well, that's not going to work. So I went to another interview, and another same thing happened. Everybody, and I'm like, what is going on? Why does like, if they asked me for Cantonese, I would So I eventually would not end up getting a job in Hong Kong. But I said, you know, I need to learn Mandarin, obviously. I mean, that's kind of the thing. And so I took a trip to the mainland. I went to Beijing and China. That was my first time in China. And I took a trip as a tourist to see if I could actually live on the mainland. Remember, just 2001, still sort of early days. And, you know, I've never been to the mainland, and I didn't know. And, you know, I just spent maybe less than a year, not even a full year in Asia. So I'm like, I don't know if I can do this. You know, let me go and see it. And I spent 1 month in Beijing, 1 month in Shanghai, and I decided, yes, I can do this. I can live on the mainland. And so the next step was to actually enroll at a university to study Chinese, because the economy back then, the .com, at least what I do, was not very, you know, good, and everybody was sort of, a lot of people doing master's degrees. I said, you know what? I'm not going to do it, because there's going to be a lot of people with master's degrees, MBAs and things like that. And I'm like, I'm going to learn Mandarin Chinese. And I enrolled at Beijing Shifan Daxue, Beijing Normal University, to study Chinese. I even got a scholarship from the Chinese government. I actually went back to Serbia, spent a year there with my family, and then I would eventually come back. But that's kind of my path from sort of Serbia to the U.S. and to China, right? So, and then I came back after a year in Serbia. I came back, and I've been here pretty much ever since. I've obviously made some trips back, and actually for COVID, I was out of China, but that's kind of the story.
Well, I guess my first question is, you know, when you came in 2001, obviously that's not 2024 China, completely different level of development. So can you walk us through what was China like a little more than 20 years ago?
Yeah, I'm very happy that you asked that. And I mean, you know, obviously you spent a lot of time in China as well. And just, I think you obviously came a little bit later than that. And you just, if you think about, you know, 10 years ago or whatever,
2012 was very different. Yeah.
Right. So it is just amazing how much it has changed. It's just indescribable. And you know, obviously people talk about, so I mean, I can tell a couple of stories. Like I was my first stop was in Shanghai. I took a train from Hong Kong to Shanghai. I still had the train ticket. It was not the high-speed rail, it was just the regular rail.
Yeah, the old green trains.
Yeah. And I ended up, so I was in Shanghai, stayed at a hostel, youth hostel, that's actually on, I forgot what it's called. It's like the Astor House. It's now a hotel. It's actually a very famous hotel that part of it was a youth hostel. And for example, so it's 2001, and people, there's a couple of pictures on the internet, like Pudong in 91 and, you know, whatever now, and or 2001, 10 years, 15, 20 years later. But so I went to Pudong, I remember, and I think the TV tower was there, or the TV antenna, whatever. But obviously many other buildings were not there. And I went there, and I remember it as being a giant construction site. And I went there because there was going to be some event. Now, obviously, I forget what it was. It was some international event, you know, wasn't the expo, but something like that. And I went there, and, you know, I sort of walked around, and it was giant. I mean, can you imagine, like, all Pudong just being one giant construction site? It was amazing. And I went around, and it wasn't so much that it was impressive. I mean, there was nothing really to see because a lot of it was just a construction site. I walked around, and, you know, little would you know that, whatever, 15 years later, I would actually live in Pudong. And my daughter would go to school in Pudong, and I would live where I went to visit. In any case, it was I mean, everybody obviously talks about construction and new buildings and all of that, and highways, and which is true, of course, and that's visible to the naked eye. But I think, and there was a couple of somebody posted a video recently, and it's not just the construction; it's the people have changed, the quality of life has changed, the people's philosophy of life has changed. So much has changed that a lot of it is just not. I mean, I'm still processing it, to be honest. It's hard to talk about, and I think it's going to be a while because one of the things that I think what's amazing about China, it's not that it happened. That's amazing too. That but it happens so fast that I don't think we're able to. Even the people, us who are here, are not able to process it because it has to happen, in our lifetimes. It's almost like, people talk about
time travel.
well, that's one thing, but people also talk about, like, let's say our grandparents or our parents even, who were born. There was barely radio, maybe not even TV, right? My mom was born. There was no TV. It was like radio. That was the only thing that existed. And now she's, we're talking on Skype or Zoom or what have you, with video and live over, continents and stuff. And, just to think about that change where you didn't even have TV and now it's real live conversation. That's the kind of thing that happened in China, right? That's the kind of change. So it's really hard in our lifetimes. Not even like half of our lifetimes or a quarter of our lifetimes, right? So it's really something. It sounds like a simple question. Tell us what China was like in 2001. And it's like, it's not even possible. I mean, that's why people post pictures, because that's the easy part, right? Oh, there's now all these buildings, and back then there wasn't these buildings. But it's not just that. It's in every possible way, right? Culture and people and mindsets and just amazing.
Well, I have a couple of questions based on what you said. You spent 10 years in the United States, and then you moved to Hong Kong and decided to move to China's mainland. But most people assume, especially Americans, right, that, oh, if I could choose to live anywhere, I would choose to live in America. But you chose to stay in China's mainland, and you've been here for more than 20 years on and off. So why did you choose China and not, Missouri or California?
Well, glad you asked that question, and I'm very happy to actually talk about something else. So, talk about something that very few people talk about. At least, I think it's definitely true in my case, but I think it's true for a lot of people. So, the people who sold me on China were Americans. Okay, I did not go to the U.S. planning to go to China ever. China was not on my radar as a Serbian ever, right?
Right.
In fact, I'll tell you another story that when so I told you I was in Hong Kong, then I sort of decided to go to Beijing, and go to school, but I went back to Serbia. So I went back to Serbia, which I haven't been in Serbia for a long time because I was in the US and, war and stuff like that. So I went back to Serbia and met a lot of people, obviously, and my parents, family, and other people, but friends. And I told everybody I'm going to move to China in 2001. And in Serbia at that time, it pretty much was taken as if somebody, like, if I went back and I went and told my friends I'm moving to North Korea, okay, it doesn't matter what's the reality. What I'm saying is, if you told that to somebody today in Serbia or anywhere, they would think that you are crazy, right? I mean, it doesn't matter what the reality of is in North Korea.
Sure. Absolutely.
I'm just saying, just
the
perception,
outlook in the West.
right?
Yeah.
Perception of people is that you are obviously, and especially, I'm coming from the U.S. and so now I'm back in Serbia. I come from the U.S., which is perceived as a very successful, and I was in Silicon Valley. I was doing really well, and they say, you want to go to China? Something's not okay with you. And I'm from it's a city, but it's a pretty small town, 300,000 people, whatever. So literally, people were talking around town and saying, Nick, he's back from the U.S. Oh, this guy, I haven't seen him in so many years. And yeah, he wants to go to China. Oh, what happened? So, but that was really, especially back then, the perception in Serbia, obviously, but I would say probably around the world. And so when you say, well, why did you choose China? Well, I didn't really choose. I didn't sit there and say, oh, maybe I should go to China. It was really in the U.S. The company that I was working for was expanding in Asia in general, but in China as well, in Hong Kong. And they were the ones who said, the first time they suggested, I was like, oh, well, let me think about it for a day, right? I mean, it's like somebody asking you, so even though I was young and I didn't have family, whatever, I wasn't married, so I could do anything I want. But it was a bit strange. So I was sold on China by, Americans or the U.S. And I think that's especially these days, it's a very important message to pass. Because back then, I mean, it's not just Serbia. I've talked to also some Europeans and other people back then. I remember, one of the headlines back then, I remember was, because already there was some talk about China sort of being the next Asian tiger. Remember Korea and Japan and Taiwan were Asian tigers, and they said, well, China's going to be another Asian tiger. And there was a headline that I distinctly remember saying, or some people were talking about, what's the big deal about China? It's just Italy with 1 billion people. Now, if you go back then and you look at the GDP, the nominal GDP, you can actually do it now. You can go back and sort of China GDP in 2001 or something, or 2002. It was actually the same GDP as Italy.
Wow.
So it was not a lie. It was not a bad headline. It was true. But so some people said, why is everybody talking about China? It's just Italy with 1 billion people. But a lot of, especially Americans, saw, the opportunity. And so that's how I got into it. And that's, so when people say, I think that's also very important sort of message to pass these days, as we know, because of everything that's happening in terms of U.S.-China relations, that it was actually the Americans in the U.S. that sort of figured out that, there's something about China. Okay. And I was in the U.S. So that's why I picked China. So you say, why did you pick China? It's not because I dreamed about China my whole life or had a dream to go to China one way or another. It's because I was in the U.S.
Well, I guess the next question I want to, because we're time bound a bit. You mentioned that President Xi Jinping is planning on visiting Europe, and Serbia is among the countries that he's going to visit. So, as a Serbian, what do you make of that? What's your outlook?
Well, first of all, Xi Jinping has visited Serbia. Now, remember, Serbia is about, just a reminder for people, it's about 7 million people. It's about, for Americans, I like to say it's essentially Missouri. Oddly, because I was there. It's in terms of the area and the number of people and everything, and even sort of the GDP. So it's not a very rich country, but it's not a poor country, but it's not a very rich country. So Xi Jinping went and visited Serbia 3 times since he's been the chairman and the president. So what's that? 12 years, and he's been 3 times, and that's a very big, I would say, honor for Serbia because, for example,
that's a lot of visits.
That's a lot of visits for such a small country. And for example, I was just posting about it. Last U.S. president to visit Serbia was Jimmy Carter, believe it or not. So Biden came.
Wow.
When he was vice president, he came, and that was the highest level visit by a U.S. Government official. Obviously, some minister of foreign affairs came, and I'm not sure about Blinken, but in any case, Xi Jinping has obviously come 3 times, and that's a big honor for Serbia. And as people probably know, there's been a lot of investment by China into Serbia. Serbia is part of the Belt and Road, and is one of the, probably sort of per capita, I'd have to do the numbers, I should do that, probably one of the biggest investments of China in general. And also definitely one of the biggest investments in Europe. So just
Mhm.
for viewers, Serbia is not part of the European Union
Mhm.
officially. It's been in the process of becoming a member of the European Union for 2 decades now, which is
Mm.
probably the longest that any country has ever been in that process. It hasn't become one for various reasons. Some internal issues in Serbia, obviously, the whole Kosovo situation is not resolved, and so Europe is less, is a little bit hesitant to accept somebody with border issues. Um, and also, EU itself is having some expansion, second thoughts. And in any case, Serbia is not part of the EU, which is, for some people in Serbia, a bad thing. But it has allowed Serbia to open up to China a little
Mhm.
bit faster than if it was a member, because then, if you're a member, then everything has to sort of go through Brussels and so on, and so they can slow things down a
Yeah,
little.
Italy received an enormous amount of pressure to back out of the Belt and Road Initiative, and they were
So
members for years.
right, so you know, it's kind of an interesting discussion in Serbia itself, because I think the fact that Serbia has not become a member, even though it wanted to become a member, has given it a little bit of more freedom to sort of pursue its own uh, opportunities, I would say. And so also credit to President Vucic, who is the one that I think also pushed that relationship, even personal with what I understand. I don't know the details, but even personal with Xi Jinping. Um, and so Xi Jinping is going to France, my understanding is, and then he's going to stop in Serbia, and then he's also going to stop in Hungary, and then and then eventually he'll go back to China. But another thing about Serbia, for example, interesting, is that Serbia was one of the first countries in the world. Don't hold me on it. I mean, we can Google it, whatever. But certainly in Europe, that gave China 30-day visa-free um, access.
Wow.
This was 7 or 8 years ago.
Well, maybe my wife and
Now,
I will
now,
never
now
visit.
there's now there's a lot of countries that are doing it, and China is also doing it. So China also did it reciprocally, but it was and it did it for tourism. So that was obviously the first European country where Chinese could just get on a plane and go to Europe.
Yeah.
Serbia is obviously not Paris. Doesn't have a coast. It's not like Croatia. It doesn't have islands or whatever. It's not the hottest. It's not Greece. It's not the hottest tourist destination in Europe. However, it is part of Europe, and it was an opportunity for Chinese to it was one of the first times that, I've talked to many, many, many Chinese at the time. They're like, what do you mean I can just get on a plane and just go to Serbia? And I said, yes, you can do that. And I was, what's there to do in Serbia? Well, there's a couple of things to do. I don't want to belittle Serbia. There's, obviously nice things to do in Serbia.
Don't throw Serbia under the bus.
Yeah, I'm not going to do it. But, um, but it is Europe. I mean,
Mm.
whatever, official sort of is it a member of not a member of the EU? It is Europe, and it has a European culture. And so
Well,
for a lot of Chinese, it was very interesting.
I want to ask a follow-up question. So you were talking about investment by China into Serbia, whether it's through the Exim Bank or AIIB or whatever. A lot of the international discourse about Chinese investment is debt trap. So for Serbia, what has Chinese investment meant?
Yes, and let's also. I'm glad we're talking about this because, and I mentioned to you, it's a very interesting topic, especially because obviously I'm Serbian and I'm and obviously I'm familiar with China as well. So not a lot of people are talking about it. People talk about, for example, Sri Lanka, whatever. I don't know anything about Sri Lanka. You don't know anything about Sri Lanka. We just read some stuff online, whatever. But I can talk about Serbia, and I can talk about China, and I know exactly what has happened. Um, so the total investment that China has made into Serbia over the past, and it's pretty much, Xi Jinping's time. I mean, obviously there's some little stuff back before that, but it really sort of ramped up after that with the PRI, is now officially, I saw the number, $10 billion. Now, not all of that has been spent, okay? Usually when these kinds of deals, when they're made, it's like, okay, $2 billion investment into something. It doesn't mean, it's like, here's $2 billion. It's like, it actually happens over time.
Mm.
Um, but that's sort of the top number is $10 billion, which people can think whatever, is it a lot of money or a lot? But it's a lot for Serbia. Let's put it that way. Now, I should mention that European Union, for example, has invested more, and I want to be fair. But remember, Serbia is in Europe, right? European Union is like we're surrounded by the European Union. So I think this, I forgot the number, the total top number for the EU, but I think it's something like $20 billion.
Mm-hmm.
So, you could say it's double, sure. But again, I mean, it would be like saying, European Union invested in, some country neighboring China, for example, I don't know, Vietnam, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's like double. So it's obvious that China is going to invest more in countries around China, and then obviously the European Union or the US will invest as well. What I mean is, so the number is quite big, and even more importantly, it's some of the key projects and investments. Okay, and so I think we should sort of cover a little bit about what they are. So before I get into what they are and how strategic and critical they are for Serbia, I would also want to say some people. So a lot of Serbia is not a monolith like China isn't, but even Serbia isn't. And so there's different opinions about investments and stuff. So one of the arguments about this number is that it's a bigger number, it's a bigger amount of money than, for example, former Yugoslavia's debt. So critics of Vučić and also this sort of investment drive will say, well, that's a lot of money that Serbia didn't borrow even during former Yugoslavia, Tito times, like 40 years. But first of all, you have to take account in inflation, right? So that's one thing. And from that perspective, it's actually less money, right? The second thing is Serbia also owes more than that, obviously, to EU and IMF and all the other, so the Chinese debt is actually probably less than 30% of the total debt. Mm-hmm. And Serbia is actually very not in debt. Serbian debt to GDP is something like 60%.
Well, I guess the question is are the investments leading to economic activity that more than compensates for whatever the initial investment was?
So let's talk about that. And I will mention a couple of projects that I'm very familiar with. Serbia is a small country, so I'm very familiar with those projects. So one of them is a copper and gold mine in the city of Bor, which is where my father was from and where I spent a bunch of summers. Okay, it's a mining town. The mine has been around for over a century. It used to be owned by the French before World War II, right? So then after World War II, it was owned by Yugoslavia, and then as Yugoslavia fell apart, it was owned by Serbia, and it really wasn't doing well to the point where it was almost going to be shut down. So I'm very familiar with this city, okay? I spent summers with my grandma in this city. It's a mining town. Whatever people imagine mining towns around the world, it's pretty much the same. And so eventually China would invest and buy it. I think the company's called Xijin. I forgot what it's called, but it's a big Chinese mining company. They own a bunch of mines around the world and in China, and it's a copper and gold mine. So one of the criticisms, and I always like to talk about criticisms as well because there's a response to it. So it's mostly a copper mine, but it also has some gold. So one of the criticisms that has been thrown at Serbia or Vučić or even inside Serbia is that, oh, China is taking Serbia's gold, right? It's not a lot of gold, it's not the biggest gold mine in the world, whatever. There's some gold there. It's actually a bigger copper mine. But so they say, oh, China's taking all Serbia's gold. But as Vučić has explained, the contract is like this. So, obviously the Chinese company bought this mine. They invested a lot of money because it was very much behind on everything, on technology and everything. And specifically on the gold, the contract is like this. So Serbia has what's known as the right of first refusal. What that means is whatever gold the Chinese company digs up, they first have to offer it to the Serbian state, and at market prices, whatever the price of gold is on the world market. And then if Serbia says we don't want it, then they can sell it. They can do whatever they want with it. And according to Vucic, I think I've seen, and in some of the even some of the numbers I've seen recently on X, Serbia is pretty much buying all of it. Okay, so no Serbian gold is being taken by China. In fact, Serbia is buying all of it. China is just is invested in technology and is digging it out. So that's one project.
And is it creating economic activity around the town? So is it employing Serbian people and creating economic activity?
So this is something that I know personally. And this is why I've read a bunch of articles about Bor, and even in New York Times and places like that. Somebody will go from New York and go to Bor, all places. And then I read the article and I'm like, I know this town. I grew up there with my grandma, right? I mean, summers, right? And I know the people, I know the neighbors, obviously. I had some friends there. I'm not in touch with some of them. So that it was a dying town after Yugoslavia broke up. When Yugoslavia broke up, a lot of obviously industry just collapsed for obvious reasons. One is war. The other one is a lot of it was obviously domestic markets, supply chains, things like that. So a lot of the sort of even successful companies in Yugoslavia just went essentially bankrupt. And one of them was this mine. It was still sort of barely operating. And so when China came, so one of the things, for example, and I was in Bor, actually, I was in Serbia a few years ago, and I took my wife and daughter. We went there. Well, my wife, actually, I didn't take my daughter. And it was my first time in Bor after a long time. It's a new city. It's a completely new city. And their salaries are now the average. So it's a mining town in undeveloped part of Serbia. Let's put it that way. Their salaries now, average salary, is higher than university professors in the capital in Belgrade.
Wow.
And these are, I mean, I'm not talking about necessarily miners. A mine obviously has miners, but it also has administration and technology and people, truck drivers and all kinds of people, right? So we're talking about sort of the average salary is higher than university professors in Belgrade, which is still not high. I mean, Serbia is still relatively poor country. So I know for a fact, and I've also looked at the town. Roads have been obviously rebuilt. The city, has been all kinds of infrastructure project. Obviously not the subway. I was going to say the subway, not the subway.
Probably housing developments, that kind of thing.
Housing,
right.
Roads, pipes, all kinds of water. So it's been, and also that city is not a stranger to foreign investors. I said the French were. I know the story. The French were there for 50 years, for example, back before World War II. So the whole city also, is sort of, there's these myths and stories about, the French in town and so on. So now what some people are complaining is pollution, which I remember. So that's one thing that I remember growing up in Bor, if you will. It's a mining town. Okay. There's going to be pollution. Now, the pollution actually got better for a bunch of time in 2000s before the Chinese company came in. And I say, why? Because it wasn't really working. That's why. And so anyway, so there's a little bit of, people are like, oh, we have a lot of pollution. It's a mining town. That's what the town does. It's been like that for 100 years. And yes, there's more pollution now than maybe 20 years ago because the mine just wasn't working 20 years ago. So anyway, but there's another project if you want me to talk about.
Sure, absolutely. Please do.
That is, I mean, there's probably 20 projects that I can talk about, but I'll talk about
let's take one more. Yeah.
Well, two more. One is, I'll just briefly mention one, and that is the high-speed rail. So Serbia has a high-speed rail that China built, financed, and built partially. So there's other contractors and so on, but it was built as part of the BRI. And it's going to go from Belgrade, capital Serbia, to Budapest. There's a small section that's already live that I've actually took a bunch of times. It's transformational. It's, I mean, in terms of how it works, I don't need to say anything to you or anybody Chinese. It's just, it works just like the Chinese high speed. It's 200 kilometers, so it's not the fastest one, but it's obviously quite fast. And it's transformational. It goes from my hometown to Belgrade right now. It's already live. It's 35 minutes. I'm in Qingdao. I'm actually in Huangdao, so that's the other side of the bay. It takes me an hour on subway, which is excellent. It takes me an hour to get to the other side of the bay. It takes me 35 minutes to get from the second largest city in Serbia to the capital. I essentially call it subway. That's what it has become, really. So the two largest cities are going to sort of merge, right? So that's one project. But actually, I want to talk about another one because it's had an even bigger impact on. So this is kind of developing. The other one is the steel mill, which is also an interesting project because it used to be by U.S. Steel. So another one, it was sort of a a big industry in former Yugoslavia, of course, and then former Yugoslavia broke up, and then so now you have a sort of a smaller one piece of it has this steel mill, and it was losing money, and then U.S. Steel bought it and ran it for I think about 5 years. And eventually they got out of it. And when I say they got out of it, they sold it back to the Serbian government for $1.
Oh my.
So you can imagine what that was. I mean, it wasn't really
It was writing it off their books.
Exactly. So and so what happened was, I forgot exactly what year this was, maybe 2008 or 9 that this happened. Somebody can Google it. Don't hold me on it. But anyway, so that around that time. So anyway, Serbia was trying to find another foreign investor because again that place was needed a lot of investment to sort of be brought up to speed to modern technology. It went back for I don't know 50 years or 100 years, whatever how long it was there, and it needed a big investment. And so the Serbian government had a bunch of tenders and was trying to find a strategic partner, essentially somebody to buy it. And nobody bought it. So there was like 3 or 4 tenders. Nobody would invest. And it was actually quite cheap, at that point. The problem with steel mills, and this is sort of, I didn't know this either, but Vučić was explaining, is that you have to keep the sort of the fire going. Because if you shut it down, I'm not an expert in this, but the way Vučić was explaining, if you shut it down, it costs like $200 million to get the fire up going again.
Wow.
Something like that. Maybe not 200, maybe it's 50, whatever, but it's a lot of money. So you don't want to shut it down. So it's been running, actually, even though it wasn't making, or it was making so little steel. So people were not even going to, like, it was just like the basic crew that was maintaining it. And like 5,000 people were just sent home and were actually paid salaries, very little salaries, but just to sort of keep them. And nobody would buy it. It went like that for 2 or 3 years. It used to be, back in the old days, it used to be like 3 or 4% of Serbian GDP. I mean, that's how big it was. And nobody would buy it. And so it went for 3 or 4 years. And even, a lot of people, in Serbia, as the opposition, but even we were telling Vučić, like, because it costs money to run it. They said, just shut it down. It's like, it's over. It's not going to happen. Nobody wants to buy it. U.S. Steel left. None of these European companies want to buy it. Shut it down. And he's like, it used to be 3%. So he just went, he just wouldn't give up, to his credit. And he actually told his story. So that's around the time when Serbia started engaging China. And so he went and it's not the hottest thing to propose to a foreign investor because nobody would buy it. It's not like, we have this mine, gold, you can kind of go and dig gold. I mean, that was kind of a quote unquote easy sell. But this steel mill was not a good deal. And so, and this is actually the story that Vučić himself has told. So he had a conversation with Xi Jinping personally. And he said, this is really important for Serbia. Right? I mean, we have all these other things. We want to do the train, and we have a mine, and there's other things you can invest in. But we have this steel mill, and it's really important for Serbia. I really want to keep it. And obviously I'm guessing he was trying to sell it. He didn't really say it's a bad deal. In any case, And this is something that he has actually sold it on CGTN. I think there was an interview. He told the story. He said that Xi Jinping said, "Don't worry about it. It's going to be handled." And so
Wow.
that's and so the Chinese went in there, invested, and now own one of the Chinese steel companies. I forget what it's called. But in any case, they went in. So it's 5,000 jobs, and it's not just it's not just the 5,000 jobs that everybody knows. It's the entire area, right?
Yeah. All of the supporting businesses
and supply chains and truck drivers and supermarkets that and the restaurants that feed the and families and the whole thing. And so I actually don't know if the it's also a JV. I think the Serbian government still owns a piece of it. But anyway, it's actually called I think they call it. It was one of the first investments, and it was kind of strategic. I hope the Chinese company is making money off of it. But certainly it's strategic because it's in Europe and it gives them some leverage and on steel prices and so on.
Right. Yeah.
But it was one of the deals that sort of sealed that friendship, and they even call it like the iron friendship between Serbia and China.
Literally iron.
Right.
Well,
So-
I want to change the topic because we
Right.
don't have a lot of time, but there are a couple of things I wanted to ask you specifically. So, in terms of China's exports, solar, EVs, offshore and onshore wind, obviously this is a it's largely impacting Europe. Europe is talking about this all the time. Different countries have different opinions. Different leaders have different opinions. Some of them are investing in China. Some Chinese companies are investing in Europe. But, is this overcapacity? Is China flooding Europe with solar that is too affordable? What do you make of this?
Too affordable. I like that. I like that. It's like don't make it too affordable. Make it more expensive. I want to pay more. What do I make of it?
Yeah, as a Serbian,
right. And it's also kind of interesting for Serbia as well. I mean, if you really want to take that perspective, if we want to take that perspective, because Serbia, first of all, is a landlocked country, and if you want to import oil or natural gas, now you have this Russia thing, and importing natural gas or oil. It's a national security issue, to be honest. And you can sometimes be a victim of geopolitics, and you have to pay more for energy and things like that. And so Serbia, it's actually China's also investing in solar and wind in Serbia, but so. Not to sort of again go into that the rabbit hole of Serbia and everything and national security and all that kind of stuff. I understand. So what do I make of it? I understand the concern in Europe and also in the U.S. EVs as well. That European or U.S. or Western in general industry is sort of going to be run over by Chinese products, and so it's not overcapacity. It's over. What is overcapacity? If you can sell it, then it's not overcapacity.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That's my sort of take. Is
the definition of the word.
The definition, right? I mean, and it's not just Europe, of course. It's also Africa or Latin America, and it's the rest of the world, right? It's also Russia and what is it, ASEAN? How do you pronounce it? So there's a whole world out there to sell cars and solar panels, and everybody needs it. So I don't think it's going to be an overcapacity. In fact, I've seen somebody comment it's actually undercapacity. They still don't have the capacity for China to sell it to the rest of the world. Now, what U.S. and European companies are concerned about that also do solar panels and wind and EVs and so on, car makers, they're concerned that they're going to be sort of quote unquote run over in their own markets too, not just. And that is so I want to I'm me and I'm very pro China and I understand that concern. One of the things that I remember from back in to sort of wrap it up in our initial conversation, China was also very protective of its own industry back in the day, right? In 2000s, 1990s. And it didn't just the foreign investors, including American investors, European, they just said, "Oh, here's the money, we'll just invest everything." And China said, "Okay, we'll take a big chunk, but these things you can't touch, and there's some rules how you invest," which was essentially protectionism, which was a smart decision. because then it allowed, Chinese companies to develop as well, obviously. Otherwise, everything would be owned by, foreign investors. Like it would just be owned by foreign companies. So that was good. Now, I mean, it was good for China and it was good for investors because they also made money. But what I mean is like right now, it seems like Europe and the US, sort of the table has turned. And so I understand the concern. And I even think, to be honest, that Europe and the US will have to do some things that might be interpreted as protectionism. And that's okay, in my opinion, in this, as long as it's sort of done, because the way China did it, right, is they said, if we just let you come in with all your money, you're just going to buy up everything and we're just going to be we're just going to work for you for the rest of our lives. So China said, you can come in with a little bit of money or with a lot of money, but, it has to be a partnership. And I think, so that we can develop as well, and we can, then we both of us it was sort of a win-win. So I think U.S. and Europe will have to do some protectionism, but it should be done in such a way that it benefits both sides, because I think ultimately,
win-win, right?
Right, and ultimately this the trade war with the U.S. and even with Europe to an extent. Is not going to help the U.S. I mean, if you think about what Trump did, and when he was in power, whatever 2018, it hasn't. He's put in all these tariffs and everything. Has it solved the problem? No, it has actually made it worse in some sense. So for the U.S.,
CPI dramatically increased. It can't all be attributed to that, but certainly some of it can.
So it wasn't. I mean, it was. So it's sort of like, okay, you have to put some sort of measures in, but you also have to have a long-term plan, which I don't think, for example, Trump did or U.S. did it at that time, which maybe was whatever, understandable. But I don't see it now either. So this is why it concerns me. It also concerns me about Europe, is that you want to put tariffs or what have you. Fine, if that's what you have to do to protect your industry. But what is the plan? And you should really be looking to make partnership with these Chinese companies, solar or EV or what have you, so that you can actually benefit, just like China has benefited, right? It's the same. It's the same sort of, and I don't see that, and that's very concerning, because not only will it lead to quote unquote conflict, economic and political and trade wars and things like that, but it will actually not help the U.S. and Europe, and that's really what concerns me.
Well, I agree. I agree. Actually, I think you're actually pointing out a really interesting thing. One of the things that China's done in order to get around some of these trade restrictions is they've been building factories in Vietnam so that Vietnam could export. So who wins? Vietnam. So China and Vietnam, and then the importing country. Another thing that the Chinese company did in the United States in Ohio was do a JV to build a factory to build solar for the U.S. market. So there are 1,000 U.S. workers now working in Ohio for a joint venture between an American company and a Chinese company. I think it's called Illuminate USA, and they're a factory employing American workers to build Chinese technology for the American market. So it's kind of a win-win. These, like you said, it needs to be a balance where all the partners get something.
One of the things that I'm kind of interested in doing is doing a study of, well, I wouldn't be the first one or the last one, but Chinese sort of develop, how has China done it, right? And I mean, obviously through a lot of hard work and a lot of investment and so on, but they have, as you know, so they've taken investment, they've protected themselves, they've learned, and I mean, so there's obviously a lot of details there, and I think a lot of lessons. These are not ideological, these are business lessons. How do you actually, if you're behind, how do you get ahead?
Yeah.
Maybe even win with without doing it the way a lot of people are recommending around. It's just put tariffs and kick them out and whatever. So
right.
Because China has actually done it. I mean, they've so how do they do it? So I mean, there's obviously a lot of little details, and I think Europe and the U.S. can learn from it, and that's the amazing thing, is they can learn from China. And I think that's one of the things that I think China has done so well is they've gone out and learned. I mean, China has learned a lot from the U.S. and from Europe and from other places also, from Serbia, from Yugoslavia. I remember them coming in, many years, decades ago. They learn. They come in. The delegation would come in, and they would study how Serbia does things, and this company or that company, and they would take it back and they would obviously adapt it. And that's the key. Also, you don't just copy paste.
Mm-hmm.
You adapt to your local, with the Chinese characters. You
Right.
sort of figure out, but you learn the lessons. And I think that's what the West is not doing right now. It's not. There's so many lessons
Well, I
to
want to
learn
ask
from
you,
China.
I have more questions to ask. I want to talk about CPI because you have an unusual vantage, having lived in the United States, having lived in Europe, and now living in China for so long, and you travel back and forth. How would you characterize the cost of living as compared to these three regions of the world?
Well, obviously, a very good question and a very difficult question that a lot of people are struggling with. Um, I think that obviously the GDP and the GDP per capita are, so I'm actually somewhat of a defender of those numbers because I always say we don't have better ones, right? We don't, unfortunately, we don't have better ones, but they're horrible numbers to compare. So then there's sort of the, what is it, PPP, the purchasing power,
Yeah,
gets a lot closer. Um,
Big
and as
Macs
you and I
for
know, right?
dollars.
As you and I know, so I think from my perspective, I can also say, uh, everybody goes through different stages in life. I was, when you're a student, you eat macaroni and cheese, and I actually used to make a lot of money in Silicon Valley, especially because I was single, right? I didn't have family, I didn't have anything, so I just made a lot of money, but I spent it all because I was a student and I was just partying and I went to Vegas and whatever. And now I think back and I'm like, man, you just blew off a lot
The
of, but
wasted opportunity. That's why I think that too. I
um,
could have done
but
so much with that time.
right, and now I actually make less money than I did back then, but I also spend less. Why? Because I don't need to go to Vegas because I've been there or whatever, Macau and things like that. So also people's needs change and so it's very also hard to even within one person's lifetime, people's sort of spending habits and need like you want to buy a house.
Mhm.
Back then I didn't care. Um, I would say, as we know, that life in China is the way I keep it in my head right now. I would say that most what we call middle class Chinese, right, which is what's the official number now? I don't know, 500 million or something.
Something like that. Depends on
Something
who you ask. Yeah.
right, and it depends on how you define it and all that kind of
Yeah.
stuff. But anyway, and this is the people that we know, that you and I know and hang out with, our friends, and obviously we don't go in the poorest parts of the country, and also we don't know the billionaires, Chinese billionaires and millionaires, the sort of people in the middle. I think their quality of life today is as good as, I don't want to say better, but as good as the quality of life of the U.S. that I know. And remember, also, I haven't lived in the U.S. for many years. Last time I was in 2008, so it's actually been a long time since I was even visited. So I just watched the online videos. But as good as um, the life that people lead in the U.S. and Europe. Okay, that's my subjective, personal feeling. What does
I mean,
that mean?
I agree
Right?
with you. I think there are obviously nuanced differences. Like, for example, a lot of Americans like, oh, I don't want to live in an apartment. I want to have a yard. So you have obvious differences that we can point out in the way that society is structured or the way that life is structured. But I think that's an accurate assessment. Also, it's pretty fair. I want to ask you a different question. I think this is probably one of. I have two more questions I'm going to try to squeeze into this interview. This is an important question for me. In terms of Europe, in terms of America, we were talking about, you'd be crazy to want to move to China in 2001. Well, I think that a lot of people in America, at least, I'm not sure about Europe, are still under that misconception that China equals bad. Why would you go there? What are you doing? But not everyone. Obviously, there are a lot of people who are like, China's the future and they want to come here. But for a lot of people, they're like, why would you move to China? So my question for you is, what misconceptions about China do you see in the media in Europe or the United States that you think are inaccurate? And how do you see China as someone who's living in Qingdao?
Jason, I love your questions, but this is the wrong question because it should be the opposite question. What
Oh,
is accurate? What is
sure.
accurate about China? You know what I
Great.
mean?
Yeah.
Just kidding. I mean,
I'll do that actually in the future.
I'm just, it's. Well, I think that's because that's a lot easier question. That's a lot
Yeah.
more. That's a lot more difficult question because the answer to
Mm,
your initial question is everything is wrong. I mean, I can't think of a single thing that is accurately depicted in Western media about China.
mm.
Now, that's why I think, I mean, it's kind of a sweeping statement to say there's not a single thing. And obviously, we can probably find one or two things that are accurate. But so that's, I mean,
China
and so
does have
something,
pandas. It's true.
right, something like that, it's like, but not roaming around the streets. You have to go to the zoo, unfortunately. But I think it's just so amazing that everything, literally everything, is wrong, and it's not. I mean, there's obviously some, we can talk about social credit and, all this kind of made up stories about, sort of big stories that are wrong about China. But, you know, um, I've been asked even by my American friends, it's like, how is it to live in surrounded by cameras? But so it's just, there's so many misconceptions. Another thing that you also mentioned, it's in the previous question or the previous conversation that we had is people actually get used to people have misconceptions. What I wanted to mention is the apartment versus the house. So I know a lot of Americans who grew up in houses and they say I can't live in an apartment, and they came to China and they lived in an apartment. They say, well, that's okay. It's like I got used to it. It was weird for maybe 3 months, and then I get used to it. And it's fine. It's like the same thing. I remember, U.S. also has New York City and San Francisco where people actually live in apartments.
Mm,
So um, I would say, but just to get back to your specific question, I would say everything is wrong.
mm,
We really have to find, and it's really amazing um, that it's actually so easy to come here, especially now. Especially, I mean, obviously we had COVID, which was difficult. Um, but now it's so easy, and even now some visa restrictions have been taken out. So a lot of countries have visa free access, and
mhm.
even if you have to get a visa, it's really easy actually. Um, People should just come and see and realize, and I don't know if you have had these conversations with other expats of ours, our friends, that people will say just the realization. It's just become so crazy that people don't even realize that people in China, they wake up every day, they eat some breakfast, they go to work, they have some lunch, they come back from work, they have dinner, they watch some TV, or they get online these days, whatever they do, and they maybe go out and meet friends and what have you, and then they go to sleep. And that's that's that kind of life that happens everywhere, right?
Right.
it's
Exactly.
it's the same. And so, but it almost feels like that some of these people around the world, especially in the West, think that life in China doesn't work that way. What do you mean it doesn't work that way? You wake up in the morning, you put your pants on, you go to work. So like everybody, right? And they feel like, there's all these sort of, I don't know, they make up these stories, and
Mm,
it's really amazing that it's also very easy to, a lot of people, especially in the USA, do your own research. It's not a lot of money to come to China.
yeah.
Plane tickets are a little expensive, but visas are nothing. Hotels are, relatively cheap. Food is cheap compared to the West, for example. So it's actually not expensive to come here.
Mm.
So I invite people to come and spend a week. You're not going to see 1 billionth of China in a week, but it will be better than the picture that you have now.
My next question, you kind of already answered it. And this is a question I like to ask everyone is, given, sane people want peace between countries, between people, between nations, between cultures and civilizations. So what can we do to further deepen understandings between, China, the United States, and Europe, especially because those are the places that you have lived? What are the things that you would recommend for diplomats or for individual people to encourage peace between these regions of the world?
Well, I can't speak for diplomats and politicians and, agendas and stuff like that because they're obviously bigger and I don't have an influence on them. and none of us do. But as ordinary people, I think we need to look at everybody. Everybody needs to look at everybody, right? Including, Chinese also need to look at Americans and Europeans and what have you as people. It sort of goes both ways, right? Americans also get up in the morning, go to work, and despite what people think, actually don't care about China, because they got other things to do. They turn on the TV and then they hear all these stories. So I think people need to learn about everyday life. And I think, sure, there's politics, even in China and obviously in the US, and there's all these kinds of things that we really cannot influence as individuals. But what we can do is we can understand that, there's people living and they have their views and they have a right to their views. And as long as they don't get into your hair, which I don't have many, but whatever. Well, you know what I mean? It's like,
Yeah.
Everybody has a right to be whatever they are. And, you don't have to fight, and you have to respect other people and realize that they just are living their lives just like you are. And, the Chinese don't think to be honest, the Chinese don't think about Americans every day. They just live their lives, most people. And same thing for Americans, they live their lives and really don't care about China. It's only when they go on social media or turn on the TV, they hear all these stories, whatever, this is happening, that is happening. For what it's worth, let's say it's entertaining, but it should not drive people's opinions. So that is my message. What we can do is we can learn about everyday life. By the way, and I should say this, YouTube is a wonderful tool. I mean, their company, they do all kinds of things. You can go on YouTube, and I think I had a post about it on X recently. There's so many amazing videos about China, also about the US, also about Serbia even. Like you can go and watch videos of random tourists, in Serbia having a great time, and learning about, what, like if you travel, what you would do. So that's, go on YouTube and watch, not let me explain China to you or let me explain the US to you and the geopolitics and the government, and this, that, and the other. Tourists, people going and traveling, and I think if you watch a lot of those, which is kind of fun to watch and, interesting, people who have no intention of, doing any sort of propaganda, like random foreign tourists. Like if you don't want Westerners, there's like Malaysians and Singaporeans and, Africans or Indians traveling to China. Watch those videos. Right? If you want to sort of get a neutral perspective, and that's what people should do, and really learn about everyday life and realize that the politics of it is tiny percentage. It's actually not that important. I mean, every country has to have some sort of politics and diplomatic relations and economic relations, and that's fine. It needs to happen, but that is like 1% of what matters.
Well, thank you so much. That that's a really good idea. It's a kind of a unique answer. I ask a lot of people. Most of them, I have not actually had that answer that people should go and watch tourists on YouTube. I think that's a really good answer. And also push aside the politics of it and just look at daily life and we're all the same. I think that's a really positive way to pursue kind of like a more human understanding of one another and our different political spheres. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello.